My name is Rachel Martinez, and last Christmas my family made one critical mistake. They assumed I was powerless. They assumed that because I was the unmarried daughter living back home, I had nothing to offer and everything to lose. They were wrong on both counts. What happened next changed our family dynamics forever, and it all started with an empty spot at the gift table and a manila folder I'd been carrying for weeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flute slipped from my cousin Maria's fingers just as she finished unwrapping her third gift of the evening. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor of my parents' living room in Millbrook, creating a sound that seemed to slice through all the forced holiday cheer. For a moment, everyone froze. Mom's perfectly orchestrated Christmas Eve dinner had its first crack in the facade, but it wouldn't be the last. I was sitting in the corner armchair, the old blue recliner that had been Dad's favorite until his back surgery made it too uncomfortable. Now it was where they put me, separate from the main seating area where the real family gathered. The velvet upholstery had faded over the years, much like my position in this household. As Maria apologized profusely for the broken glass, I watched my family's reaction. Mom immediately rushed to clean it up. My sister Carmen grabbed the dustpan, and my brother David made jokes to lighten the mood. Everyone sprang into action except me. I just sat there, observing, counting the gifts that had been distributed so far. Carmen had received a new laptop, jewelry, and gift cards totaling what looked like several $100s. David got an expensive watch, tickets to some sporting event, and an envelope that was clearly stuffed with cash. Even Maria, who wasn't immediate family but had married my cousin Tony 5 years ago, had received multiple presents. The coffee table was littered with torn wrapping paper, discarded ribbons, and the detritus of a family that clearly had money to spend. On everyone except me. The living room smelled like Mom's famous cinnamon cookies and the pine candles she lit every Christmas. The tree stood in the corner, 8 feet tall and decorated with ornaments we'd collected over decades. Each one told a story of family memories, vacations, achievements. There were ornaments celebrating Carmen's graduation from law school, David's promotion to regional manager, even Maria's acceptance into the family. But as I scanned the branches, I couldn't find a single ornament that represented anything I'd accomplished. It was as if my 34 years had left no mark on this family's history. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its deep resonance cutting through the chatter and laughter. I'd been listening to that clock my entire life. As a child, I'd count the chimes to know when bedtime was approaching. As a teenager, I'd sneak in late and hold my breath, hoping it wouldn't chime and wake my parents. Now, as an adult, it seemed to be counting down to something I couldn't quite name yet. Mom returned from the kitchen with a fresh bottle of champagne, her face flushed with the effort of hosting and the warmth of the fireplace. She looked around the room with satisfaction, taking in the scene of her family gathered together. Her eyes swept over Carmen showing off her new jewelry, David already reading through his sporting event tickets, Dad dozing lightly in his chair after too much wine. When her gaze landed on me, there was a brief flicker of something. Not guilt, exactly, but recognition. She knew what she'd done, what they'd all done. The gift exchange was clearly over. The beautifully wrapped packages that had been stacked under the tree that morning were now reduced to a few small items, probably forgotten stocking stuffers or gifts for neighbors who might stop by later. I'd been sitting in that chair for over an hour, watching everyone else's Christmas morning unfold, waiting for someone to remember that I existed. But no one did. Carmen walked over to Mom with her new laptop tucked under her arm. "This is incredible, Mom. I can finally upgrade my home office setup." She hugged our mother tightly, and I could see the genuine affection between them. It wasn't fake or forced. Carmen really was grateful, and Mom really was proud of being able to give her something meaningful. David had already put on his new watch, and was taking selfies to post on social media. "Dad, this is perfect. How did you know I wanted this exact model?" Dad chuckled from his chair, pleased with himself. "I've been paying attention, son. I know quality when I see it." The warmth between them was real. The love was real. The problem wasn't that my family was incapable of caring for each other. The problem was that somehow, at some point over the years, I'd stopped being included in that circle of care. I'd become the outsider looking in, the afterthought, the one who was present but not really seen. I shifted in the recliner, and the old springs creaked in protest. The sound made Carmen look over at me for the first time all evening. "Rachel, you're being awfully quiet over there. Everything okay?" Her voice carried that particular tone family members use when they're checking a box, fulfilling an obligation to acknowledge someone without really wanting to engage. "Everything okay?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. I could have said yes, played my role as the pleasant, undemanding daughter who was grateful just to be included. I could have smiled and nodded and pretended that sitting there empty-handed while everyone else celebrated didn't feel like a knife twisting in my chest. I could have been the bigger person, the understanding one, the one who didn't make waves. Instead, I reached for my purse. The leather bag sat beside my chair, an expensive piece I'd bought for myself last year when I'd gotten a bonus at work. It was one of the few nice things I owned, and I'd debated whether to bring it tonight or choose something less conspicuous. Now I was glad I'd chosen it. Image mattered in this family, even if they pretended it didn't. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I'm doing better than okay. In fact, I brought some gifts of my own this year." I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents I'd been organizing for weeks. I thought it was time I contributed something meaningful to our family Christmas. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of family contentment, but the sharp quiet that comes when something unexpected is about to happen. Mom paused with the champagne bottle halfway to Maria's glass. Carmen stopped scrolling through her phone. Even Dad opened his eyes and focused on me with the kind of attention I hadn't received from him in years. I stood up slowly, the folder in my hands feeling heavier than it should. For 34 years, I'd been the daughter who didn't rock the boat, who didn't demand attention, who accepted whatever scraps of affection were left over after everyone else had been served. But carrying this folder had changed something in me over the past few weeks. Knowledge, it turns out, really is power. And I'd been gathering knowledge for a very long time. The hardwood floor was cold under my bare feet as I walked toward the coffee table where all the opened gifts lay scattered. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful in a way my movements hadn't felt in this house for years. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, their curiosity mixed with something that might have been concern. They'd never seen me like this before. Confident, prepared, in control. I placed the folder on the coffee table, right in the center where Mom's decorative Christmas centerpiece usually sat. The manila surface looked official and serious among all the festive wrapping paper and ribbon. It was a stark contrast, and I could see that everyone noticed it immediately. The folder represented something different from everything else in the room. It represented truth. "Rachel," Mom said, her voice carrying a warning tone I remembered from childhood. "What is this about?" I looked around the room at my family. These people I'd loved my entire life, who'd shaped me and frustrated me and disappointed me in equal measure. Carmen with her successful law practice and her perfect marriage. David with his corporate job and his house in the suburbs. Mom and Dad with their comfortable retirement and their pride in their successful children. All of them looking at me now like I was an unknown quantity. Someone who might upset the carefully balanced dynamics they'd established. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the quiet daughter they'd been ignoring had been paying attention to everything. They had no idea that their assumptions about my powerlessness were about to be challenged in a way that would change everything between us. I smiled at them, the kind of smile I'd learned to wear in boardrooms when I was about to deliver news that would shift the entire trajectory of a project. "This," I said, opening the folder to reveal the first set of documents, "is about contributions. It's about value. It's about who really takes care of this family." The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the half hour. 8:30 on Christmas Eve. The moment when everything changed. Mom set down the champagne bottle with shaking hands. Carmen closed her laptop. David pocketed his phone. Even Maria, who usually stayed out of family drama, leaned forward in her seat. They could sense that whatever was about to happen would be significant. They just had no idea how significant. I pulled out the first document and placed it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. It was a bank statement, highlighted and annotated in my careful handwriting. "Let's start with last month," I said, my voice steady and professional. "November 2023. Anyone want to guess how much money I contributed to this household?" The silence stretched between us like a bridge I was about to burn. But some bridges, I'd learned, were meant to be burned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some relationships could only be rebuilt from the ground up, with honesty as the foundation instead of assumption and neglect. This was going to be the Christmas my family finally learned who I really was, and who they really were. The fire crackled, in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, it had started to snow, the first snowfall of the season, creating a winter wonderland that would have been perfect for family photos and holiday memories. Inside, we were about to have a different kind of memorable moment, the kind that divides family history into before and after. I was ready for whatever came next. The bank statement lay on the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom, and I watched my family's faces as they tried to process what they were seeing. The numbers were highlighted in yellow marker, impossible to ignore. $4,367. That was my contribution to the household expenses. In November alone, not including groceries, not including the utilities I'd quietly started paying when Dad's pension couldn't stretch far enough, not including the property insurance that had somehow become my responsibility over the past 18 months. Carmen leaned forward, squinting at the document. Her legal training kicked in automatically, and I could see her mind working as she scanned the line items. Mortgage payment, property taxes, homeowner's insurance, repairs to the furnace that had broken down in October. All paid from my personal checking account. All signed with my name. "Rachel," she said slowly, her voice taking on that careful, lawyer tone she used when she was trying to gather information without revealing what she already suspected. "What exactly are we looking at here?" I pulled out another document, this one a spreadsheet I'd created myself, meticulously tracked, over the past 2 years. Every expense, every payment, every time I'd opened my wallet to cover something this family needed. The columns were color-coded, green for household expenses, blue for medical costs, red for emergencies. There was a lot of red. "We're looking at reality," I said, placing the spreadsheet next to the bank statement. "We're looking at exactly who's been keeping this family afloat while everyone else has been busy with their own lives." Mom's face had gone pale, and she was gripping the arm of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She kept looking between the documents and me, like she was seeing a stranger instead of her daughter. In some ways, maybe she was. The Rachel she knew didn't make scenes. The Rachel she knew didn't keep records. The Rachel she knew certainly didn't confront the family with evidence of their neglect. But that Rachel had been disappearing slowly, over the past few years, replaced by someone who'd learned that keeping track of things mattered. Someone who'd learned that being taken for granted had a price, and eventually, someone was going to have to pay it. David stood up abruptly, his new watch catching the light from the tree. Wait a minute. You're saying you've been paying the mortgage? On this house? His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. In his version of our family story, Mom and Dad were financially stable retirees who might need help with yard work or technology, but certainly not money. Not just the mortgage, I said, pulling out more documents. Each one told a piece of the story he'd missed while he was busy climbing the corporate ladder and building his perfect suburban life. The property taxes that were 3 months behind when I moved back home. The medical bills from Dad's surgery that insurance didn't cover. The new roof we needed after that storm in September. The plumbing repairs, the electrical work, the 1,000 small emergencies that happen when you're trying to maintain a house that's over 40 years old. I spread the papers across the coffee table like a dealer spreading cards, each one representing a crisis that had been quietly solved while my siblings lived their lives without interruption. Carmen's wedding had gone off without a hitch because I'd made sure Mom and Dad could afford their contribution to the reception. David's promotion celebration had been held in this very living room because I'd paid to have the carpet cleaned, and the walls repainted after a pipe leak had caused water damage. The fire popped loudly in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney, and we all jumped slightly. The sound broke some of the tension in the room, but only for a moment. Maria reached for her wine glass with trembling fingers, clearly uncomfortable, with the family drama unfolding around her. She'd married into this family expecting warmth and dysfunction in manageable doses, not financial revelations and accusations. How long? Dad's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through, the silence like a blade. He was looking directly at me for the first time in months, really looking, and I could see the moment when he began to understand the scope of what I'd been carrying alone. 2 years and 4 months, I replied without hesitation. I'd been counting. Since you had the heart attack and Mom broke her wrist the same week. Since I took leave from my job in Portland to come home and help. Since everyone agreed it would be temporary until you both got back on your feet. The word temporary hung in the air like an accusation. We all knew how these things worked in families like ours. The unmarried daughter, the one without children, or a spouse to consider, the one whose life was seen as the most flexible, was the one who made the sacrifices. It was expected, understood, never discussed directly, but always assumed. Carmen was reading through my spreadsheet with the intensity she usually reserved for legal briefs. Her perfectly manicured finger traced down the columns, and I could see her calculating totals in her head. When she reached the bottom line, her finger stopped moving entirely. "Jesus, Rachel," she breathed. "This says you've contributed over $90,000 in the past 2 years. $93,412 to be exact. But who was counting besides me? I'd been keeping track because someone had to. Because when you're the one writing the checks, you learn real quickly how much everything costs. You learn that maintaining a family's comfortable life requires a steady stream of money that somehow everyone assumes will just appear when needed. "Where did you even get this kind of money?" David asked, and there was something in his voice I didn't like. Suspicion, maybe, or disbelief that his little sister could have access to resources he didn't know about. I reached into my purse again and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. "That's an excellent question. And since we're being transparent tonight, let me show you exactly where it came from." The second folder contained my employment records, tax returns, and investment statements. Documents that painted a picture of a woman who'd been far more successful than her family had ever bothered to notice. When I'd left Portland, I hadn't, just been running away from a broken engagement and a disappointing life. I'd been leaving behind a senior consultant position at a firm that specialized in financial restructuring for struggling businesses. I'd been leaving behind a salary that was significantly higher than what any of them were earning. But more than that, I'd been leaving behind a hefty severance package, stock options that had matured beautifully, and a retirement account that I'd been contributing to aggressively since my early 20s. The broken engagement had meant I'd kept the down payment we'd saved for a house. The canceled wedding had meant a refund on deposits that totaled more than most people made in 6 months. I'd come home with resources, and I'd been quietly using them to keep my family's world stable while they treated me like a charity case who'd failed to launch. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been subsidizing the lifestyle of people who pitied me for not having the life they thought I should want. "You had this money the whole time?" Mom's voice was small, confused. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what? That I could afford to help?" "I did help. Every month for over 2 years. What I didn't tell you was that I was keeping track of every penny." I pulled out a calculator and set it on the table next to the documents. "What I didn't tell you was that I was treating it like a loan, not a gift." The word loan changed. The atmosphere in the room immediately. Gifts were given freely, with love, with no expectation of return. Loans had terms. Loans had interest. Loans had consequences if they weren't repaid. Carmen straightened up in her chair, her lawyer instincts, fully engaged now. "Rachel, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that for 26 months, I've been the primary financial support for this household. I'm saying that while you were all living your lives and building your careers and raising your families, I was here paying the bills, covering the emergencies, making sure Mom and Dad could maintain their dignity and their independence." My voice was getting stronger with each word, fueled by years of suppressed frustration. "And I'm saying that somehow, in all of that, I became invisible. I became the family failure who was lucky to be included in Christmas dinner, instead of the person who made Christmas dinner possible." David sat back down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "We didn't know, Rachel. If you'd told us." "Told you what? That I needed help? That I couldn't handle it alone?" "When exactly would have been a good time for that conversation? When you called twice a year to check in? When Carmen sent birthday cards but couldn't find time to visit? When was I supposed to interrupt your busy, successful lives to mention that I was bankrupting myself to keep our parents afloat?" The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they'd been building inside me for so long that they had their own momentum now. Years of phone calls where no one asked how I was managing. Years of family gatherings where my contributions were acknowledged with a pat on the head and a thank you for helping out. Years of being treated like the spinster aunt who was grateful for any inclusion instead of the financial lifeline that was keeping the family together. Maria stood up quietly and walked toward the kitchen, probably sensing that this was about to get even more intense. She was smart to remove herself from the line of fire. This was old family business, the kind of deep-rooted dysfunction that only comes from years of unspoken expectations and unexamined assumptions. The grandfather. Clock chimed 9 times, marking another hour in what was becoming the longest Christmas Eve of my life. But also, strangely, the most honest one we'd ever had. The first strike. Dad finally spoke, his voice gruff with emotion and something that might have been shame. "Rachel, honey, we never asked you to." "To what? To care? To step up when you needed help? To sacrifice my own life so you could maintain yours?" I interrupted, and the sharpness in my voice made him flinch. "You're right, Dad. You never asked. You just assumed. You assumed I had nothing better to do. You assumed my life was less important than Carmen's career or David's family. You assumed that because I wasn't married and didn't have children, I was available to be your unpaid caregiver and silent financial backer." The words were coming faster now, fueled by years of careful politeness and swallowed resentment. "Do you know what I gave up to come home? I had a corner office in a downtown high-rise. I had a team of 12 people reporting to me. I had clients who paid me more for a week's consultation than most people make in a month. I had a life, Dad. I had friends and activities and a future I was building." Carmen was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, which was probably accurate. The Rachel she knew was accommodating, self-deprecating, always ready to minimize her own accomplishments to make others feel comfortable. This Rachel was angry, articulate, and armed with documentation. But when you called me that night from the hospital, I continued, looking directly at Dad, crying because you didn't know how you were going to manage Mom's care and your own recovery, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my life and came home because that's what family does. That's what I thought family did. I pulled out another document. This one, a resignation letter from my old job. I gave up a $140,000 salary to come home and take care of you. I liquidated my retirement accounts to pay for your medical expenses. I sold my condo in Portland to free up cash for the house repairs and ongoing costs. The numbers were hitting them like physical blows. I could see Carmen doing math in her head, probably calculating what my earning potential would have been if I'd stayed in Portland, what my retirement would have looked like, what my net worth could have been instead of what it actually was after 2 years of subsidizing their lives. And you know what the worst part is? I asked, my voice breaking slightly despite my attempts to stay controlled. It's not the money. I can make more money. It's not even the career, though rebuilding at 34 is going to be harder than it would have been at 32. The worst part is that you let me disappear. You let me become invisible while I was saving your lives. Mom started crying then, quiet tears that ran down her cheeks without any accompanying sobs. She wasn't crying for herself, I realized. She was crying because she was finally seeing what she'd done to me, what they'd all done. They'd let me sacrifice everything while treating me like I was the one who needed their charity. Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration, I became more and more transparent. David's work stories got longer and more detailed. Carmen's legal victories got more attention and praise. Maria's pregnancy announcements, the grandchildren's achievements, everyone's lives became more important and more interesting than whatever I might have been doing. I gestured around the living room, at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. Look at those pictures. Really look at them. How many of them include me from the past 2 years? How many conversations have we had where anyone asked about my day, my work, my life? How many times has anyone in this room acknowledged that I've been holding this family together? The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. They were looking at the photos now, really looking, and I could see them realizing what I'd been seeing for months. I'd become the family ghost, present but not really seen, essential but not acknowledged. David cleared his throat awkwardly. Rachel, we appreciate everything you've done, but what? But I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve? But I should be happy that my sacrifice allowed everyone else to live their lives without interruption? But I should consider it an honor to bankrupt myself for the privilege of being ignored at family dinners? The anger was flowing freely now, years of careful control finally breaking down. Do you know what I did today before coming over here? I spent 4 hours trying to figure out how to pay for the property taxes that are due next month. 4 hours on Christmas Eve, working through budgets and trying to decide which of my remaining investments to liquidate, while you were all out shopping for gifts that somehow didn't include me. Carmen flinched at that last part, and I could see the guilt settling over her face like a shadow. They'd all participated in the gift exchange planning. They'd all decided, collectively and without discussion, that I didn't merit the same consideration as everyone else. We thought... Carmen started, then stopped, probably realizing that any explanation she offered was going to sound inadequate. You thought what? That I didn't deserve gifts because I don't have a traditional life? That I should be grateful just to be included in the dinner? That my contributions to this family were somehow less valuable because they were financial instead of emotional? I was standing now, pacing slightly, the energy of finally speaking my truth making it impossible to sit still. Let me tell you something about contributions. Every month for over 2 years, I've contributed more to this family's well-being than any of you combined. But because it was money instead of casseroles, because it was bill paying instead of babysitting, because it was practical instead of sentimental, it somehow didn't count. The fire was dying down in the fireplace, the logs collapsing into glowing embers that cast shifting shadows on the walls. The Christmas tree lights blinked steadily, a cheerful counterpoint to the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the room. Outside, the snow was falling harder, creating the kind of winter evening that should have been cozy and warm instead of tense and revelatory. "I want you all to understand something," I said, my voice dropping to a quieter but more intense register. "This isn't about the gifts. This isn't about feeling left out of Christmas morning. This is about respect. This is about recognition. This is about treating me like a valued member of this family instead of a convenient solution to problems you don't want to handle yourselves. Armchair. When others join." Carmen stood up abruptly, her new laptop sliding off her lap and onto the couch cushions. Her face was flushed, whether from embarrassment or defensive anger, I couldn't tell. "Okay, Rachel, I get it. You've been helping. Mom and Dad more than David and I realized. But you're acting like we've been deliberately cruel to you, and that's not fair." The word fair hit me like a slap. Fair. After 2 years of financial and emotional labor that had gone largely unrecognized, after being excluded from gift exchanges and treated like a family obligation instead of a family member, she wanted to talk about fair. "Not fair?" I repeated, my voice climbing despite my efforts to stay calm. "Carmen, do you know what's not fair? Not fair is having to choose between paying your parents' property taxes and contributing to your own retirement. Not fair is watching your siblings build their dream lives while you liquidate your future to maintain their parents' dignity. Not fair is being treated like the family charity case when you're actually the family's primary financial supporter." David joined in, his defensive instincts clearly activated. "Look, we didn't know you were keeping track of every penny. We thought you were helping out because you wanted to, because you were living here anyway and it made sense for you to contribute." Contribute? The word came out like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "David, I wasn't contributing. I was carrying. There's a difference between helping with expenses and single-handedly preventing financial collapse." I pulled out another document, this one a financial projection I'd run last month. "Do you want to know what would have happened if I hadn't moved home? If I'd stayed in Portland and lived my own life while you all figured out how to handle Mom and Dad's crisis?" The spreadsheet showed a clear timeline of financial deterioration. Without my intervention, the house would have gone into foreclosure within 8 months. The medical bills would have destroyed their credit and possibly forced them into bankruptcy. The maintenance issues would have compounded until the house became uninhabitable. "They would have lost everything," I said quietly. "The house, their independence, their dignity. They would have ended up in assisted living or moving in with one of you, completely dependent instead of living comfortably in their own home." "What?" Carmen studied the projection, her legal mind automatically checking my assumptions and calculations. I could see her trying to find flaws in my analysis, hoping to prove that I was exaggerating the crisis I'd prevented. But the numbers were solid, the timeline realistic, the consequences unavoidable. "So what?" David said, his voice taking on an edge I didn't like. "So what if we would have had to make some hard decisions?" "That's life, Rachel. Sometimes families have to make sacrifices." "Some families," I repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words, because as far as I can tell, I'm the only one in this family who's made any real sacrifices. You kept your job, your house, your lifestyle. Carmen kept her practice, her marriage, her social life. Mom and Dad kept their home, their routine, their independence. I'm the only one whose life got completely derailed. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft crackling of the dying fire. I could see them processing what I'd said, probably for the first time really considering the scope of what I'd given up to maintain their status quo. But instead of acknowledgement or gratitude, what I got was more defensiveness. "Nobody forced you to come home," Carmen said, her voice sharp with irritation. "Nobody held a gun to your head and made you pay their bills. You made those choices. Rachel, you can't make choices and then resent us for the consequences of your own decisions." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd just shown them, after laying out the evidence of my sacrifice and their neglect, her response was to blame me for caring too much. "You're right," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Nobody forced me. I chose to put family first. I chose to believe that taking care of the people you love is more important than protecting your own interests. I chose to trust that my family would value my sacrifice, even if they couldn't match it." I gathered up the documents on the coffee table and stacked them neatly. What I didn't choose was to be invisible. I didn't choose to be taken for granted. I didn't choose to be excluded and dismissed and treated like my contributions didn't matter because they came in the form of checks instead of covered dishes. Maria reappeared from the kitchen, probably drawn back by the raised voices. She stood in the doorway uncertainly, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. I felt sorry for her, being witness to the implosion of the family she'd married into. "And David," I continued, turning to face my brother directly, "you want to talk about forced choices? Nobody forced you to stay in Minneapolis and keep your comfortable life while your parents faced financial ruin. Nobody forced Carmen to maintain her law practice and social calendar while I handled crisis after crisis alone. Nobody forced either of you to assume that I would handle everything indefinitely without support or recognition." Dad tried to interrupt, his voice weak but attempting authority. "Rachel, that's enough. We're family. We don't keep score like this. Don't we?" I pulled out one more document, this one a simple piece of paper with a list handwritten in my neat script. "Because I've been keeping score, Dad, and the score is pretty lopsided." I read from the list. Number of times Carmen has visited in the past year, 4. Number of times David has called to check on your medical recovery, 6. Number of times either of them has offered to help with expenses, 0. Number of times they've acknowledged my contributions publicly, 0. Number of family gatherings where my life and work have been discussed with genuine interest, 0. Each 0 hit the room like a small explosion. The evidence was undeniable because it was simply factual. They couldn't argue with documented absence. "But here's my favorite statistic," I continued. "Number of times I've been included in family gift exchanges since moving home, 0. Until tonight, I thought it was an oversight. Now I realize it was a statement about how much you value what I bring to this family." Carmen was shaking her head, her earlier defensiveness cracking into something that looked like genuine distress. "Rachel, the gifts. We thought you wouldn't want. I mean, you always say you don't need anything." "When?" I demanded. "When have I ever said I don't need anything? When have any of you ever asked what I might need or want? When have you treated me like a person with desires and interests instead of just a convenient solution to problems?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, because the truth was, they had never asked. They'd made assumptions about what I wanted, what I needed, what I deserved, and they'd built their entire relationship with me around those assumptions without ever bothering to check if they were accurate. "I've been subsidizing this family's lifestyle for over 2 years, I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. "I've been the reason you could all sleep peacefully at night knowing Mom and Dad were taken care of. I've been the invisible safety net that let you all live your lives without worry or interruption. And in return, I've been treated like the family pet. Appreciated when convenient, ignored when not actively needed, and certainly not considered an equal member of the family unit. White, grace under fire." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the snow hitting the windows, tiny crystals of ice tapping against the glass like frozen tears. I looked around the room at my family, these people I'd loved and supported, and sacrificed for, and I felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like clarity. I sat back down in the blue recliner, but this time I didn't sink into it like I was trying to disappear. I sat forward, alert, present in a way I hadn't been in years. The manila folders were still spread across the coffee table, evidence of a truth that couldn't be denied or dismissed, but I was no longer clutching them like weapons. They'd served their purpose. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "I'm going to give you all a gift tonight. A real gift, not the kind that comes wrapped in pretty paper and tied with ribbons, but the kind that actually matters." Carmen leaned forward slightly, probably expecting another revelation, another document that would further expose their neglect. David was staring at his hands, his new watch catching the light from the Christmas tree. Mom and Dad were holding hands now, united in their guilt and confusion about how their family had reached this point. "I'm going to give you the gift of truth," I continued, "and the gift of choice. Because that's what adults do for each other. They tell the truth about what they need, what they can give, and what they expect in return. They don't make assumptions. They don't keep silent scores. They don't martyr themselves and then resent others for not reading their minds." I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, where I'd been drafting thoughts for weeks without really knowing what I planned to do with them. "The truth is, I've been enabling all of you to take me for granted. I've been so focused on being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who never rocks the boat, that I forgot to be a person with needs and boundaries and expectations." The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room felt cooler, now more intimate somehow. The Christmas tree lights continued their steady blinking, creating a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Outside, the world was being covered in white, transformed into something clean and new. The truth is, I chose to come home and help because I love you all, but I also chose to keep quiet about the cost because I was afraid that if I spoke up, if I made demands, if I acted like my needs mattered as much as everyone else's, you might decide I wasn't worth the trouble. Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and I could see her recognizing herself in what I was describing. The family dynamics that had taught me to be grateful for scraps instead of expecting a full seat at the table. Truth is, I've been as much a part of this dysfunction as anyone else. I've been keeping silent tallies instead of having honest conversations. I've been building resentment instead of setting boundaries. I've been playing the martyr instead of being direct about what I needed from all of you. I stood up again, but this time it wasn't from agitation. This time it was from a sense of purpose that felt new and powerful. "So here's the choice part of your gift. You get to decide, right now, tonight, what kind of family we're going to be going forward." I walked over to the Christmas tree and unplugged the lights, leaving us illuminated only by the fireplace and the lamp beside Dad's chair. The room felt more serious now, more ceremonial somehow. Option 1. We go back to the way things were. I continue to subsidize this household. You continue to take it for granted, and we all pretend this conversation never happened. I'll be the family ghost who pays the bills and gets patted on the head at holidays. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to press against the glass, as if the outside world was holding its breath waiting for our decision. I could feel the weight of 34 years of family history, all the patterns and assumptions and unspoken agreements that had brought us to this moment. Option 2. We start over. We have honest conversations about who contributes what and how we acknowledge those contributions. We treat each other like equals instead of like some people matter more than others. We build a family dynamic based on mutual respect instead of convenient assumptions. I pulled out one final document from my purse, this one a simple contract. I'd drafted but never intended to actually use. Or option 3, we make this official. I continue to provide financial support, but we formalize the arrangement. Clear expectations, regular check-ins, agreed upon terms for how long this continues and what happens when it ends. Carmen's eyes widened as she recognized what I was holding. A contract. Legal terms and conditions for family relationships. It should have been absurd, but given everything that had just been revealed, it somehow made perfect sense. "You wrote up a contract?" David asked, and I couldn't tell if his voice held admiration or horror. "I wrote up a contract because that's what you do when you want to make sure everyone understands their obligations and benefits, when you want to prevent misunderstandings and resentment, when you want to treat a serious arrangement with the seriousness it deserves." I placed the contract on the coffee table next to all the other documents. The contract specifies my financial contributions, your parents' responsibilities, and all of your obligations in terms of communication, involvement, and recognition. It includes regular family meetings, shared decision-making about major expenses, and yes, equal treatment at family gatherings, including gift exchanges. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off the seconds while my family processed what I was offering them. 3 clear choices, each with different implications for how we would relate to each other going forward. "I know this seems cold," I said, sitting back down but maintaining eye contact with each of them. "I know families aren't supposed to need contracts and formal agreements, but we've proven that assumptions and good intentions aren't enough. We've proven that without clear communication and mutual respect, love can turn into resentment and gratitude can turn into entitlement." Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her pocket. "Rachel, honey, we never meant for you to feel—" "I know you didn't mean it," I interrupted gently. "That's exactly the problem. None of you meant to take advantage of me. None of you meant to make me feel invisible. None of you meant to exclude me or dismiss my contributions. But impact matters more than intention, and the impact of your actions has been devastating." I gestured toward the documents scattered across the coffee table. All of this evidence, all of these numbers, all of this tracking and documenting. Do you think I enjoyed becoming this person? Do you think I wanted to turn into someone who keeps financial records of family relationships? The answer was obvious, written on their faces as they looked at me with something that might have been recognition for the first time in years. They were seeing who I'd become in response to how they'd treated me, and they didn't like what they saw any more than I did. "This is who I had to become to survive in this family," I continued. "Someone who documents everything because otherwise my contributions disappear. Someone who keeps receipts because otherwise my sacrifices don't count. Someone who builds legal cases for family relationships because otherwise I'm not treated like an equal member." I picked up the contract and held it loosely in my hands. "But I don't want to be this person. I don't want to need contracts with my family. I don't want to have to prove my worth with spreadsheets and bank statements. I want to be part of a family that sees me, values me, and treats me with the same consideration they show each other." The clock chimed 10 times, and we all listened to every single chime, letting the sound mark this moment, this choice point, this opportunity to decide who we were going to be to each other from this night forward. "So, what's it going to be?" I asked, my voice soft but carrying clearly through the quiet room. "Do we go back to pretending everything is fine while nothing changes? Do we start having real conversations and building real relationships? Or do we make this business arrangement official and at least be honest about what we're doing?" I set the contract back on the table and folded my hands in my lap. "You don't have to decide tonight, but you do have to decide. Because I'm done being invisible, and I'm done subsidizing a family that doesn't see fit to include me as an equal member." The fire crackled one last time and then settled into silence, leaving us in the soft glow of the single lamp and the weight of choices that would determine whether we had a family worth saving or just a collection of people bound by blood and financial obligation. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been years in the making, and I found myself thinking about the day I first realized I was disappearing from my own life. It was a Tuesday in March, 8 months after I'd moved back home, and I was sitting in the waiting room at Dad's cardiologist office while he had his follow-up appointment. The receptionist, a kind woman named Helen who'd been working there for decades, looked up from her computer and said something that stopped me cold. "Your father is so lucky to have such a devoted daughter," she said with genuine warmth. "Most of his patients don't have anyone who cares enough to be this involved in their recovery." At first, I felt a glow of pride. I was being a good daughter. I was making a difference. But then she continued, "It's wonderful that you don't have other obligations that would keep you from being here for him." That phrase echoed in my head for days afterward. No other obligations. As if my entire existence could be summed up as having nothing else important enough to conflict with my role as family caretaker. As if my life before moving home had been so inconsequential that walking away from it required no sacrifice worth mentioning. The truth was, I'd had plenty of obligations before that phone call changed everything. I'd been 3 months away from making partner at Morrison & Associates, the financial consulting firm where I'd been climbing the ladder for 6 years. I'd been planning my wedding to James, a relationship that might not have been passionate, but had been stable and comfortable and pointed toward a future I could envision. I'd been serving on the board of a nonprofit that helped women start small businesses, using my financial expertise to review loan applications and mentor new entrepreneurs. I'd had a life that was mine, built according to my own priorities and values. But when crisis struck, all of that became background noise to the immediate need of family. And somehow, in the months that followed, everyone, including me, began to act as if that background noise had never existed at all. Sitting in that waiting room, I realized that I'd become complicit in my own erasure. Every time someone asked what I was doing with myself, I talked about helping Mom and Dad instead of mentioning the freelance consulting work I was doing to maintain some professional connections. Every time family conversations turned to career updates, I deflected attention to other people's achievements instead of sharing my own small victories. Every time someone made assumptions about my availability, I confirmed those assumptions instead of setting boundaries. I'd been so afraid of seeming selfish, so determined to be the selfless daughter who put family first, that I'd forgotten how to advocate for myself, or even how to remember that I was worth advocating for. The woman who used to command boardrooms and negotiate million-dollar restructuring deals had somehow become someone who couldn't even speak up when her own family excluded her from gift exchanges. The worst part wasn't the financial cost, though that had been substantial. The worst part wasn't even the career setback, though rebuilding professional momentum in your mid-30s was significantly harder than maintaining it. The worst part was the psychological toll of becoming invisible to the people who were supposed to know you best. I remembered the exact moment I realized how far I'd fallen off everyone's radar. It was at Carmen's birthday dinner last spring, held at an upscale restaurant downtown. The conversation had been flowing around the table, everyone sharing updates about their work, their travels, their children's milestones. When there was finally a lull, Carmen's husband Michael turned to me with the kind of polite interest you show to distant acquaintances. "So Rachel," he said, "are you still looking for work, or have you decided to make the caretaking thing permanent?" The caretaking thing, as if the previous 8 months of financial management, medical coordination, household maintenance, and emotional support could be dismissed as a temporary hobby rather than the complex, demanding, unpaid career it had actually become. As if I'd been sitting around in my pajamas watching soap operas instead of learning Medicare regulations and researching medical specialists and coordinating with contractors for home repairs. But what hurt more than Michael's dismissive characterization was the fact that no one else at the table corrected him. Not Carmen, who knew I'd been consulting remotely to keep my professional skills sharp. Not David, who'd benefited from my research when he'd needed similar specialists for his own health. Issues Not even mom and dad, who knew better than anyone how much I was managing on their behalf. They just nodded along as if Michael's assessment was accurate, as if I really had been drifting through life without direction or purpose, while they handled the important business of being productive adults. That was the night I started keeping detailed records of everything I was doing, not because I planned to use them as weapons, but because I needed proof that my life still mattered, even if no one else seemed to notice. The documentation had started as a form of self-preservation, a way to remind myself that I was contributing something valuable, even when I felt most invisible. But over time, it had become something else. It had become evidence of a systematic pattern of dismissal and assumption that ran much deeper than simple oversight or busy schedules. Looking at my family now, scattered around Mom's living room in various states of discomfort and defensive guilt, I could see that they were finally beginning to understand the scope of what they'd been blind to. But understanding the facts was different from understanding the impact. An impact was what had been eating away at me for months. "Do you know what it's like?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but somehow carrying more weight in the stillness of the room. To slowly disappear from your own family, to become so associated with problems and needs that people stop seeing you as a person with your own life and interests? Dad shifted in his chair, his face drawn with something that looked like genuine remorse for the first time all evening. "Rachel, we never thought." "I know you never thought," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "That's exactly my point. For over 2 years, none of you thought about what this arrangement was costing me beyond money. None of you thought about what I was giving up or what I might need to feel valued and supported. None of you thought about the fact that I might have dreams and goals and desires that were being systematically set aside so everyone else could maintain their comfortable lives." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow. That was still falling steadily, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of pristine white. The streetlights created circles of illumination in the darkness, and I could see a few other houses still had Christmas lights on. Families probably settling in for cozy holiday evenings without the weight of years of unspoken resentment filling their living rooms. "I used to love Christmas," I said, my breath fogging the cold glass. "When we were kids, I was always the one who insisted we open presents in birth order, youngest to oldest. I was the one who made sure everyone had hot chocolate and that the Christmas music was playing. I was the one who remembered to save the nice wrapping paper and who helped Mom clean up after dinner." Behind me, I could hear someone shifting in their chair, probably uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. But I needed them to understand how we'd gotten here, how the patterns established in childhood had evolved into the dynamics that were destroying us as adults. "I was the family helper," I continued, turning back to face them. "The responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could always be counted on to put other people's needs first. And for a long time, I was proud of that role. It felt good to be needed, to be essential, to be the one people turned to when things got difficult." Carmen was staring at her hands, probably remembering all the times she'd called me for advice or support over the years, all the crises where I'd dropped, everything to help while she maintained her boundaries and protected her own priorities. David was doing the same mental accounting, I suspected, thinking about all the ways he'd benefited from having a sister who was always available and never demanded reciprocal support. But somewhere along the way, being helpful became being taken for granted. Being reliable became being invisible. Being selfless became being worthless, at least in terms of how I was treated and valued by this family. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up one of the financial documents, not to wave it around as evidence, but just to hold something concrete. While I tried to articulate feelings that had been building for so long, they'd become almost too heavy to carry. "This money," I said, gesturing to the papers scattered across the table, "represents more than just financial support. It represents 2 years of my life that I spent focused entirely on other people's needs while my own, Dreams got smaller and smaller until they almost disappeared completely. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, 10:30 on Christmas Eve, and I realized we'd been having this conversation for over an hour. An hour of truth-telling that should have happened in smaller doses over months or years, spread out, in manageable conversations instead of one explosive revelation that was probably overwhelming everyone involved. But that was part of the problem, too. We'd never learned how to have difficult conversations in this family. We'd learned how to avoid conflict, how to smooth over problems, how to maintain surface harmony while deep currents of resentment built up beneath the calm exterior. We'd learned how to take care of each other's practical needs while ignoring each other's emotional ones. "I need you to understand," I said, looking directly at each of them in turn, "that this isn't really about money or gifts or even recognition, though all of those things matter. This is about whether we're going to be a family that sees each other clearly or a family that operates on assumptions and convenience." Mom wiped her eyes again, and I could see that she was beginning to grasp the emotional weight of what I was trying to tell them. "Honey," she said softly, "we do see you. We love you. We appreciate everything you've done." "Do you?" I asked, and the question wasn't accusatory so much as genuinely curious. Because love and appreciation aren't just feelings, Mom. They're actions. They're choices about how you treat someone, how you include them, how you prioritize their needs alongside everyone else's. I sat back down in the blue recliner, but this time I pulled it closer to the rest of the group, closing some of the physical distance that had always seemed to mirror the emotional distance I felt in this family. When was the last time anyone in this room asked me what I wanted for Christmas? Not what I needed, not what would be practical, but what I actually wanted. The question hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the answer was never. When was the last time anyone asked about my dreams, my goals, my hopes for the future beyond how they related to taking care of this family? The silence that followed was answer enough. In their minds, I'd become so completely defined by my caretaking role that they'd stopped seeing me as someone who might have independent desires and ambitions. I'd become a function rather than a person, essential but not quite fully human in the way that people with their own lives and dreams were human. "I want things," I said, my voice growing stronger with the admission. "I want to travel again. I want to rebuild my career, maybe start my own consulting firm. I want to learn to paint, take cooking classes, maybe even date someone who sees me as more than just a daughter and sister who never managed to build her own life." Saying those desires out loud felt revolutionary after months of keeping them, buried beneath layers of duty and self-sacrifice. They were modest dreams, really, the kind of goals that most adults took for granted as normal parts of life. But in the context of my family role, they felt almost scandalously selfish. "I want to be valued for who I am, not just for what I can provide," I continued. "I want to be included in family decisions, not just expected to implement them. I want to be seen as someone whose life matters as much as everyone else's, whose happiness deserves the same consideration as everyone else's." Dorser's entering enemy territory. The hardest part about coming home hadn't been giving up my career or my independence, or even my engagement to James. The hardest part had been walking back into a family system that had assigned me a role decades ago and expected me to step right back into it as if no time had passed, as if I hadn't grown or changed or developed my own perspective on how relationships should work. From the moment I'd pulled into the driveway of my childhood home with my car packed with everything I owned, I'd felt the weight of old expectations settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar but uncomfortable coat. The house looked exactly the same, down to the faded welcome mat on the front porch and the collection of ceramic garden gnomes Mom had been accumulating for years. It was as if time had stopped here while I'd been building my adult life in Portland, as if my absence had been just a temporary detour rather than a decade-long journey toward becoming my own person. Mom had greeted me at the door with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice, thanking me over and over for coming home to help. as if I'd always been destined to return to this role. Dad had been more reserved, probably struggling with his own guilt about needing assistance. But I could see the relief in his face when I started taking charge of the medical appointments and insurance claims that had been overwhelming them both. Within a week, I'd fallen back into patterns that felt disturbingly familiar. I was the one who remembered to refill prescriptions and coordinate with specialists. I was the one who handled phone calls with insurance companies and researched treatment options. I was the one who managed the calendar and the medication schedules and the follow-up appointments. It was like slipping back into a childhood role that I'd never really outgrown, even though I was now 32 years old with professional experience managing complex projects and difficult clients. But the difference was that as a child, the family helper role had come with certain protections and acknowledgments. As the baby of the family, my efforts had been praised and appreciated, seen as precocious and admirable. As an adult, those same efforts were simply expected, part of the natural order of things that didn't require special recognition or gratitude. Carmen had visited twice in those first few weeks, both times bringing flowers and staying just long, enough to see that things were under control before hurrying back to her own life. She'd been warm and appreciative, thanking me for stepping up and telling me how glad she was that I could be there since she couldn't take time away from her practice. But there had been something in her tone that suggested she saw my availability as lucky rather than sacrificial, as if I'd been sitting around waiting for something meaningful to do with my time. David had been even more distant, calling regularly, but visiting only once in the first month. When he did come, he'd spent most of the time discussing Dad's medical situation with me as if I were a hired caregiver rather than his sister, asking practical questions about prognosis and treatment plans, but showing little interest in how I was adjusting to the dramatic change in my circumstances. It was during those early weeks that I'd first noticed how quickly I was disappearing from my own narrative. Phone conversations with friends in Portland became shorter and less frequent as I struggled to find things to talk about beyond medical updates and caregiving logistics. Professional contacts began to fade as I turned down consulting opportunities that would have required travel or intensive focus. Social media posts became less about my own experiences and more about family updates and gratitude for support during difficult times. The most telling moment had come about 6 weeks after I'd moved home, when Carmen called to update me on some development in her biggest case. She'd been talking excitedly about legal strategy and courtroom dynamics, and I'd found myself living vicariously through her professional victories, hungry for the intellectual stimulation and sense of purpose that I'd been missing. When there was a pause in her story, I'd tried to share some news of my own. I'd been offered a significant consulting contract that I could handle remotely, working with a manufacturing company that was restructuring their debt obligations. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes project I'd built my reputation on, and I'd been excited about the challenge. But Carmen's response had been immediate and dismissive. "Rachel, you can't take on something that demanding right now. Mom and Dad need you focused on them. Maybe after things settle down, you can think about getting back to work." The assumption that my professional life was optional, something that could be set aside indefinitely without consequence, had stung more than I'd expected. But what hurt even more was the realization that she was probably right. I couldn't give a major consulting project the attention it deserved while managing the complexity of my parents' medical and financial needs. I'd become trapped between two versions of myself, unable to be fully present in either role. I'd turned down the contract, and within a month, the firm had stopped reaching out with opportunities. In the consulting world, unavailability quickly becomes irrelevance, and I'd watched my professional network begin to treat me as someone who was no longer in the game rather than someone who was temporarily sidelined. The family gatherings had been the most painful reminders of how my status had shifted. At Carmen's birthday dinner, at David's housewarming party, at various holiday celebrations, I'd found myself relegated to the role of family functionary rather than family member. I was the one who coordinated rides for Mom and Dad, who remembered to bring their medications, who handled their special dietary needs and accessibility requirements. I was essential to making these gatherings possible, but I wasn't really part of them. Conversations would swirl around me while I helped Mom navigate the restaurant menu or made sure Dad was comfortable in his chair. Other people would share updates about their careers, their travels, their children's achievements, while I listened from the sidelines, managing logistics and trying to pretend I didn't mind being invisible. The worst part was how quickly everyone, including me, had accepted this new dynamic as normal. It was as if my temporary move home had triggered some kind of family reset, reverting us all to roles and patterns that were decades out of date. Carmen and David were the successful adult children with important lives and demanding schedules. Mom and Dad were the aging parents who needed care and consideration. And I was the unmarried daughter whose life was flexible enough to accommodate everyone else's needs. Nobody had explicitly decided that this was how things should be. Nobody had sat down and agreed that I should sacrifice my independence and professional momentum to maintain everyone else's comfort. It had just happened. Gradually, one small accommodation at a time, until we'd built an entire family structure around my availability and self-sacrifice. The financial aspect had evolved the same way. It had started with small expenses, picking up copays at medical appointments or covering groceries when I was already at the store. Then it had expanded to utility bills and insurance premiums when Dad's pension wasn't quite stretching far enough. Before I knew it, I was covering major expenses and handling financial emergencies while everyone else continued living as if money wasn't an issue. The insidious part was how natural it had felt. At each step, I had savings and they needed help. I was living in their house and it made sense for me to contribute. I was managing their finances anyway, so it was easier for me to handle payments directly. Each individual decision had seemed reasonable, even generous, but the cumulative effect had been to create a dependency that served everyone's interests except my own. Standing in Mom's living room now, looking at the evidence of that dependency spread across the coffee table, I could see how we'd built this trap together. They'd needed my help, and I'd been willing to provide it. They'd appreciated my reliability, and I'd been proud to be needed. They'd taken comfort in my availability, and I'd taken satisfaction in being essential. But somehow, along the way, we'd all forgotten that I was supposed to be a person with my own life, rather than just a solution to other people's problems. We'd all forgotten that sustainable relationships require balance, that even the most generous arrangements need boundaries, that love without respect eventually turns into resentment. Looking at them now, I could see that they were finally beginning to understand what they'd been participating in, even if unconsciously. The guilt and discomfort on their faces wasn't just about the money or the exclusion from gift exchanges. It was about the recognition that they'd been complicit in diminishing someone they claimed to love, that they'd been benefiting from an arrangement that was slowly destroying my sense of self-worth and autonomy. The labor of love. The irony. Wasn't lost on me that I'd spent more time preparing for this Christmas confrontation than I'd spent preparing for any holiday in years. While my family had been shopping for gifts and planning menus and decorating their homes, I'd been organizing documentation and rehearsing conversations and steeling myself for a moment of truth that had been building for months. The manila folders on the coffee table represented weeks of work, not just the financial tracking, but the emotional labor of deciding what needed to be said and how to say it in a way that might actually create change rather than just venting frustration. I'd drafted and redrafted the contract, researching legal language and consulting with a lawyer friend who specialized in family agreements. I'd printed and organized bank statements, highlighted relevant transactions, created spreadsheets that would make the scope of my contributions undeniable. But more than that, I'd spent countless hours trying to understand how we'd gotten to this point and what it would take to build something healthier. I'd read books about family dynamics and boundary setting. I'd researched articles about children caring for aging parents and the psychological toll of invisible labor. I'd even started seeing a therapist, using some of my dwindling savings to get professional help processing the anger and resentment that had been building inside me. The preparation had been its own form of self-care, a way of taking my own feelings seriously, even when no one else seemed to. It had been a way of honoring the part of me that knew I deserved better treatment, even when the rest of me was caught up in old patterns of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing. Dr. Matthews, my therapist, had helped me understand that my family's behavior wasn't necessarily malicious, but it was definitely harmful. She'd helped me see that good intentions don't excuse bad outcomes, that love without respect can be just as damaging as outright hostility. She'd helped me practice saying the words I needed to say, finding language that was honest without being cruel, direct without being destructive. The goal isn't to punish them, she'd said during one of our sessions. The goal is to create accountability, to make the invisible visible, to give them the opportunity to choose differently now that they understand the impact of their choices. That guidance had shaped how I'd approach tonight's conversation. I hadn't come here to destroy my family or to hurt people I loved. I'd come here to save us from a dynamic that was slowly poisoning our relationships, to create space for something more honest and sustainable. The contract I'd drafted wasn't meant to be punitive, though I knew it might feel that way to them. It was meant to be protective, for all of us. It spelled out clear expectations and boundaries, defined roles and responsibilities, created mechanisms for regular check-ins and adjustments. It was the kind of document I would have recommended to any client who was entering into a complex, long-term arrangement with significant financial and emotional stakes. But families aren't supposed to need contracts, and I could see the shock and hurt on their faces as they grappled with the idea that our relationships had become so damaged that legal documents seemed necessary. The fact that I'd felt compelled to protect myself with formal agreements was itself evidence of how far we'd drifted from healthy family functioning. Carmen picked up the contract and began reading through it with her lawyer's eye for detail. I watched her face change as she processed the terms I'd outlined, the monthly financial contributions specified, the requirements for family meetings and shared decision-making, the consequences for failing to meet agreed-upon obligations. "Rachel," she said finally, her voice careful and professional, "this is actually a very well-drafted document, comprehensive, fair, legally enforceable, but it's also..." She paused, searching for words. "It's also the saddest thing I've ever seen." The sadness in her voice caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for anger, defensiveness, even rejection of my terms. I hadn't been prepared for grief, for the recognition that we'd damaged our relationships so severely that this level of formality felt necessary. "It's sad because it shouldn't be necessary," I agreed. "It's sad that we've gotten to a point where I feel like I need legal protection from my own family. It's sad that we can't seem to have honest conversations without documentation and evidence, and formal agreements." David was reading over Carmen's shoulder, his face growing more troubled with each clause. "These terms," he said slowly, "they're not unreasonable. Actually, they're probably less than what we should have been contributing all along. But seeing it written out like this, seeing how much you've been carrying alone..." He trailed off, probably doing the same mental calculations that had been keeping me awake at night for months. The scope of my financial contributions was shocking when laid out clearly, but it was the emotional labor that was truly exhausting. The constant vigilance, the daily management of complex needs, the weight of being responsible for outcomes that affected everyone, but were handled by only me. "The money is just the measurable part," I said. "What's harder to quantify is the psychological cost of being taken for granted, of having your contributions minimized, of slowly disappearing from your own family's awareness." Mom was crying openly now, not the careful tears she'd been shedding earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place of genuine recognition and regret. "We failed you," she said between gasps. "We failed you as parents, as family. We took advantage of your love and your generosity, and we didn't even see what we were doing." The raw pain in her voice was almost harder to bear than the years of dismissal had been. I'd wanted acknowledgement, recognition, validation, but I hadn't fully considered how devastating that recognition might be for them to experience. They were seeing themselves clearly for the first time in years, and they didn't like what they saw any more than I did. "Mom," I said gently, "you didn't fail me deliberately. You failed me unconsciously, which is different but not necessarily better. The impact was the same regardless of the intention." I walked over to where she was sitting and knelt beside her chair, something I hadn't done since I was a child, seeking comfort after a nightmare or a scraped knee. But failure isn't permanent unless we choose to make it permanent. People can change. Families can change. Relationships can be rebuilt if everyone is willing to do the work. She looked at me through her tears, and I could see decades of guilt and regret in her eyes. Not just about the past 2 years, but about all the ways she'd shaped me to be the family helper, the reliable one, the person whose needs came last, because she could be counted on to handle whatever was required. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't know how to undo years of taking you for granted. I don't know how to become the mother you deserved instead of the mother who turned you into this." Her words broke something open in my chest, a knot of anger and hurt that had been building for so long I'd forgotten it was there. But underneath the pain was something else, something that felt like possibility. "You don't have to undo anything," I said, taking her hands in mine. "You can't change the past, but you can choose how we move forward. You can choose to see me clearly from now on. You can choose to treat me like my life matters as much as everyone else's. You can choose to be curious about who I am instead of assuming you already know." The room was quiet, except for the soft sounds of her crying and the gentle hiss of the fire settling into its final embers. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world clean and white, and ready for whatever came next. "That's all I've ever wanted," I continued. "Not perfection, not retroactive appreciation for things that are already done, just the possibility that we could build something better going forward, something based on mutual respect instead of old assumptions, something that honors everyone's needs instead of sacrificing some people for the comfort of others." Dad cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion when he finally spoke. "What do you need from us, Rachel? Right now, tonight, what do you need to believe that we can do better?" The question hung in the air like a gift. The first time in years that anyone had asked directly what I needed instead of assuming they already knew, or that my needs were secondary to everyone else's. It was such a simple question, but it represented a fundamental shift in how we were relating to each other. I looked around the room at these people I'd loved and resented and sacrificed for, these complicated human beings who'd shaped me and wounded me, and were now, finally, asking how to heal what we'd broken together. "I need you to choose," I said. "I need you to decide whether you want to be the kind of family that makes assumptions or the kind of family that asks questions. Whether you want to be the kind of family that takes love for granted or the kind that nurtures it intentionally. Whether you want to be the kind of family that operates on old patterns or the kind that's brave enough to try something new." The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, marking how late it had gotten, how long we'd been sitting in this room excavating years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding. But for the first time all evening, the lateness felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The grandfather clock struck midnight, its deep chimes resonating through the house like a ceremonial bell marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day. We'd been sitting in this room for over 3 hours, excavating years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, and now we were officially in new territory. Not just a new day, but potentially a new way of being family together. David was the first to break the silence that followed the final chime. "I choose change," he said simply, his voice hoarse from the emotional weight of the evening. "I choose to do better, to be better, to see you, Rachel, really see you, instead of just assuming you'll always be there to handle whatever needs handling. His words hung in the air like a promise, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief exactly, because words were just the beginning, but something that might have been hope trying to take root in soil that had been barren for too long. Carmen nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Me too. God, Rachel, I feel like I've been sleepwalking through our relationship for years, taking everything you do for granted while judging you for not having the kind of life I think you should want. She paused, looking down at her hands. I've been a terrible sister. Selfish and blind and so focused on my own life that I forgot you had one too. The admission seemed to cost her something. This woman who'd built her career on being articulate and confident, who rarely acknowledged uncertainty, let alone failure. But there was something in her voice that suggested she understood the gravity of what she was confessing. The years of accumulated neglect that had brought us to this point. Mom was still holding my hands, her grip tight as if she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. I don't want the contract, she said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. I mean, I'll sign it if that's what you need to feel safe, but I don't want our relationship to need legal protection. I want to earn your trust back. I want to prove that we can be better without being forced to be better. Dad leaned forward in his chair, his face grave but determined. Your mother's right. We don't want to be good to you because a contract requires it. We want to be good to you because you deserve it, because we love you, because it's the right thing to do. He paused, struggling with words that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he was trying to express. I want to be the father who sees all his children clearly, who values all his children equally, who makes sure none of his children have to choose between their own happiness and their family's well-being. The words were beautiful, heartfelt, exactly what I'd been longing to hear for months. But I'd learned to be cautious about promises made in moments of crisis, when guilt and shame created temporary motivation that might not survive the return to normal life. I hear you, I said carefully, and I want to believe you. But I need you to understand that good intentions aren't enough anymore. I need to see sustained change, consistent effort, evidence that this isn't just a momentary reaction to being confronted with uncomfortable truths. I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the snow-covered neighborhood where other families were probably sleeping peacefully, their Christmas Eves uncomplicated by financial revelations and emotional reckonings. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pristine white landscape, creating a world that looked transformed, cleaner somehow, ready for new possibilities. Here's what I need, I said, turning back to face them. I need monthly family meetings, where we talk honestly about how we're doing, individually and collectively. Not crisis meetings when something goes wrong, but regular check-ins where we actually listen to each other and address problems before they become catastrophic. Carmen nodded, pulling out her phone to make notes. Always the lawyer, even in moments of family crisis, but I appreciated her instinct to document agreements and create accountability. I need financial transparency, I continued. Not detailed budgets or invasive questions about personal spending, but honest conversations about who's contributing what and why. I need to stop being the invisible bank that covers emergencies while everyone else lives as if money isn't an issue. David was writing things down too, on the back of an envelope he'd found on the side table. What about the money you've already contributed? Do you want us to pay you back? Do you want to formalize some kind of repayment plan? The question had been weighing on me for weeks. Part of me wanted to demand repayment, to make them understand the financial cost of their assumptions about my availability and resources. But part of me also knew that money could become another source of resentment and obligation if we weren't careful about how we handled it. I don't want the money back, I said after a long pause. What I've contributed, over the past 2 years I contributed freely, even if I was building resentment about not being acknowledged for it. But going forward, I need clear agreements about financial responsibilities. I need to stop being the default solution to every expense. Mom looked confused. But honey, if you don't want repayment and you don't want to keep covering expenses, how do we handle the ongoing costs? Dad's pension and our savings aren't enough to cover everything, especially with his medical needs. It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with for months. The truth was that my parents did need financial support to maintain their independence and quality of life. But they had other children, other resources, other options that had never been explored because I'd been willing to handle everything alone. That's where Carmen and David come in, I said, looking at my siblings. You've both been benefiting from my financial support of Mom and Dad without contributing anything yourselves. You've been able to maintain your lifestyles and build your wealth, while I've been depleting mine to keep our parents comfortable. The words were blunt, but necessary. For too long, we'd all pretended that my contributions were somehow different from theirs. That my money didn't count the same way because I was living in the house, or because I was single, or because I'd chosen to move home. But money was money, sacrifice was sacrifice, and it was time to acknowledge that explicitly. You're right, David said immediately. We should have been contributing all along. We should have insisted on helping instead of just being grateful that you were handling it. He paused, calculating something in his head. What if we each commit to covering a third of their ongoing expenses? Property taxes, insurance, major repairs, medical costs not covered by insurance. Split 3 ways instead of you carrying it all alone. Carmen was nodding along, already thinking through the financial implications. That makes sense. It's fair, and it's sustainable for all of us. But more than that, it makes us all stakeholders in their well-being instead of just you. The suggestion was exactly what I'd been hoping for, but hadn't dared to ask for directly. It would ease the financial burden on me significantly, but more importantly, it would create shared responsibility for our parents' care instead of leaving me as the sole decision-maker and provider. There's something else, I said, feeling my courage build with each boundary I successfully established. I need to be seen as a whole person, not just as the family caretaker. I need you to be interested in my life, my work, my goals, my relationships. I need conversations that aren't just about Mom and Dad's needs or family logistics. The request seemed simple, almost childish, but it represented a fundamental shift in how we related to each other. For years, I'd become so defined by my service to the family that my individual identity had almost disappeared. I needed them to help me reclaim that identity, to see me as Rachel the person instead of just Rachel the helper. What are your goals? Carmen asked, and the question was so direct and unexpected that I almost laughed. When was the last time anyone in this family had asked me that? I want to start my own consulting firm, I said, the words coming easily, because I'd been thinking about this dream for months. I want to specialize in helping families navigate financial crises, maybe work with elder care attorneys to provide comprehensive support for people dealing with aging parent issues. I want to turn what I've learned from this experience into something that helps other people. The idea had been growing in my mind as I'd managed Mom and Dad's complex needs, recognizing that many families were struggling with similar challenges without the financial expertise or emotional resilience to handle them effectively. I could create something meaningful from the skills I'd developed, something that honored the difficulty of what I'd been through while helping others avoid some of the pitfalls we'd encountered. That sounds incredible, David said, and I could hear genuine enthusiasm in his voice. You'd be amazing at that. You have all the technical skills, plus the personal experience, plus the emotional intelligence to really help people navigate these situations. It was the first time in years that anyone in my family had expressed confidence in my professional abilities, and the validation felt almost overwhelming. I'd been carrying around so much self-doubt about my career prospects, wondering if my time away from traditional employment had damaged my credibility or diminished my skills. I've actually been working on a business plan, I admitted. Nothing formal yet, but I've been researching the market and thinking through the service offerings. I think there's a real need for what I could provide. Mom squeezed my hands again. I want to hear about it. All of it. I want to understand what you're building and how we can support you instead of just assuming you'll always be available to support us. The conversation was taking on a momentum that felt different from anything we'd experienced as a family in years. We were actually listening to each other, asking questions, expressing interest in each other's individual lives and dreams. It was what I'd been hoping for without quite knowing how to ask for it. There's one more thing, I said, knowing this next request might be the hardest for them to understand. I need to move out, not immediately and not in anger, but I need to rebuild my independence. I need to have my own space, my own life, my own identity, separate from being your caretaker. The words created a palpable shift in the room's energy. Mom's grip on my hands tightened, and I could see fear flickering across Dad's face. They'd become accustomed to having me available constantly, managing their daily needs and handling crises as they arose. That doesn't mean I'm abandoning you, I said quickly, seeing their distress. It means I'm choosing to help you from a position of strength instead of obligation. It means our relationship will be based on love and choice instead of convenience and assumption. Carmen was nodding slowly, understanding the psychological necessity of what I was proposing. You need boundaries. You need to be able to say no sometimes without feeling guilty, to have your own life without feeling like you're neglecting family responsibilities. Exactly. I need to know that I'm choosing to help you because I want to, not because I'm trapped in a role I can never escape. I need to know that if I have other opportunities or priorities, we can figure out alternative solutions instead of just assuming I'll sacrifice whatever I need to sacrifice. The conversation continued, past 1 a.m, covering practical details and emotional needs, logistical arrangements, and relationship boundaries. We talked about how to handle medical emergencies when I wasn't living in the house. We discussed backup plans for times when I might be traveling for work or simply unavailable. We outlined communication expectations and decision-making processes. But more than the practical arrangements, we talked about how to be better to each other, how to notice when someone was struggling instead of assuming they were fine, how to express appreciation regularly instead of saving gratitude for crisis moments, how to ask questions about each other's lives instead of making assumptions based on outdated information. As the conversation wound down, I realized we'd accomplished something I hadn't expected when I'd walked into this room with my manila folders full of evidence and accusations. We'd not only addressed the specific problems that had been building for years, we'd actually learned how to talk to each other honestly. We'd practiced having difficult conversations without falling into old patterns of defensiveness and avoidance. I have one last gift for all of you, I said, reaching into my purse for the final time that evening. Instead of more documents or evidence, I pulled out a small wrapped package, something I'd prepared weeks ago but hadn't been sure I'd have the courage to give. Inside the package were 4 identical journals, simple notebooks with our names embossed on the covers in gold lettering. I want us to start writing to each other, I explained. Not emails or texts about logistics, but real letters about what we're thinking and feeling and hoping for. I want us to practice being curious about each other's inner lives instead of just coordinating our external obligations. The journals were a risk, an experiment in vulnerability that could easily fail if we reverted to old patterns of surface-level interaction. But they also represented possibility, a way to maintain the emotional intimacy we'd discovered tonight, even when we weren't sitting in crisis mode, excavating years of accumulated hurt. Carmen picked up her journal and ran her fingers over the embossed lettering. I love this idea. I want to know who you are when you're not managing our family's problems. I want to know what makes you happy, what you worry about, what you dream about when you're not focused on taking care of everyone else. As we finally prepared to end the evening, saying goodbyes that felt different from any we'd shared in years, I realized that the eviction notices I'd threatened to hand out had been metaphorical all along. I hadn't come here to kick my family out of my life. I'd come here to evict the old patterns that had been poisoning our relationships. I'd come here to make room for something healthier to grow in the space we'd cleared. The snow had stopped falling hours ago, leaving the world outside pristine and quiet and full of possibility. Inside the house, we'd done the hard work of clearing away years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. We'd created space for new ways of being family together, ways that honored everyone's needs instead of sacrificing some people for the comfort of others. Walking to my car in the early hours of Christmas morning, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because all our problems were solved, but because we'd finally acknowledged that problems existed and committed to working on them together. Not because my family had suddenly become perfect, but because we'd learned that love without respect eventually becomes unsustainable, and we'd chosen to do the hard work of rebuilding our relationships on a foundation of mutual regard. The drive home was quiet and contemplative, the empty roads giving me space to process what had just happened. In a few hours, I'd need to start making the practical changes we'd discussed. I'd need to look for apartments and begin the process of rebuilding my independent life. I'd need to start working on my business plan with the kind of focused attention it deserved. I'd need to have follow-up conversations with each family member to make sure our Christmas Eve promises translated into sustainable change. But for now, in the gentle silence of early Christmas morning, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: the quiet satisfaction of being truly seen and valued by the people I loved most. It had taken a folder full of financial documents and 3 hours of difficult conversation, but we'd finally found our way back to each other. Sometimes the best gift you can give your family is the truth about what you need from them. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the courage to ask for it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people you love will choose to meet you in that place of honesty and build something better together. The eviction notices had been served, but not on the people, on the patterns, on the assumptions, on the old ways of being family that had stopped serving anyone's highest good. And in their place, we were ready to build something that could sustain us all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.